this is why Frantz Fanon is so important in Wretched of the Earth. In the first chapter on violence, which is the most misunderstood chapter that he has written, he specifically calls out psychologists as confusion mongers. He says, scientists, educators, psychologists, you are the confusion mongers. And basically, like, you are the ones that come in with your innocent neutrality and questions and slow people's revolutionary fire. And so just from there, we have to contend. If I am somebody who's within the field, I have an ethical imperative to contend with the fact that the history of this field is one that has worked side by side, both in terms of overturning revolutionary leadership, like in Latin America, in the construction of the Zionist entity, in right now what we're seeing in the United States with anti-trans bills. Like, psychoanalysts and psychologists are central to this work.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. For the past year and a half, the world has watched Israel livestream its genocide, leaving people grasping for answers. How does a society become capable of such depravity? Some call it a disorder, sociopathy, narcissism, collective psychopathy. But this isn't a mental illness, it's ideology. It's settler colonialism operating at its most extreme. Zionism doesn't just erase Palestinians, it also expands its reach beyond the borders of the settler state. Its outposts in academia, media, and policy enforce ideological discipline, crushing anyone who challenges its power. Nowhere is this more evident than in the weaponization of psychology itself. The field of psychoanalysis has long colluded with Zionism and the settler state, justifying Israeli crimes while pathologizing Palestinian resistance. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Lara Sheehi, an assistant professor of clinical psychology, a Lebanese Arab, and author of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Lara, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It is such a pleasure to have you on. I am such an admirer of your work and everything that you do. So I'm super excited to have my audience get to see you and hear from you. And so I think a good place to start, because it's probably what a lot of people want to hear about, is the issue of Zionism as an ideology from a psychoanalysis lens. And the reason I raise that is because I think that people who, for the last year and a half especially, have been really struggling to understand Israeli society and the genocidal violence they're inflicting. And so you'll often hear it described in terms of a disorder, like these, Israeli society is sociopathic, or it's narcissistic, or there are a bunch of psychopaths. But you've pointed out that this is not a personality disorder. It's an ideological problem. And this is just what happens to people when they're indoctrinated essentially into fascism from birth. And this is an extreme version of how imperialism and settler colonialism operate. So I'm curious, can you respond to the idea that Israeli society is disordered and why that's problematic to view it that way?
Yeah, thanks for starting off with that. I think, contrary to the popular belief of Zionist detractors, I don't go down that route. And partially it's because I think it's actually incredibly important for us to be precise and sort of practice what I've come to think about, especially over the course of this more than year and a half, about militant clarity, about how do we continue to be specific and precise about the ways in which we describe the root causes of what we are seeing, rather than what I feel are detractions. We can talk about the way that fascism, settler colonialism, imperialism, these larger structural oppressive forces that conscript people into particular types of behavior on a daily basis can cause disorder, right? And when I mean that, when I say that, I don't mean just mental health disorders. I mean in the way in which people become alienated from their humanity, from the source of suffering, and also allows them to embody certain practices that cohere with ideological structures of supremacy, right? So clearly, if you are living in a world that asks you, and let's say it's within the Zionist entity, if it asks you as a part of your adherence to the ideology of Zionism to think about yourself in a supremacist hierarchy, then there are ways in which you have to enact that every single day. And I do think that there are ways in which that then translates into a disordered way of viewing the world. But I'm very careful about diagnostics. For technical reasons. One, when we work in the realm of diagnostics, we also work in the realm of cure. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about it in these ways, because then we are moving off the sort of focus of the fact that ideological formations like Zionism, like imperialism, like racism, like any one of these things, these are political positions. And they're political positions that people have to work at every single day to divest from. They're not something that we can intervene on and reform and then cure, and then maybe people get to hold on to a little bit of it. And then over time, it's sort of like, no, I think we need to be clear on the fact that when we are saying that Zionism is ideology, we are also troubling its organic nature. We are also saying this is a contested space. We are also demanding that that contested space is one that doesn't get collapsed with the things that we see, like anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. These are all the things that I think it opens up when we move away from the sort of pathological lens. The other piece is that I think that we can think about mental health disorders as incredibly ableist and categories that were created over time to depoliticize and defang the results and the sort of impact we were seeing from larger forces in the world, like capitalism. So I feel like, we're sort of taken off the path. And I'm very concerned about that, because once you go down that route, there are ways in which we are pulled away from the pulse of what is the real root of the issue. And the real root of the issue in the context of Zionism, of course, is settler colonialism. And like you said, the most extreme form of imperialism. And I think that there's an invitation there that when we start talking about it as an ideological formation, the invitation is, what is your commitment to divesting from that ideological process?
No, I'm really happy you raised the issue of something like capitalism too, because again, capitalism brings out the worst in humanity, as does imperialism, Zionism. These are ideologies that literally, they talk about CEOs having sociopathic tendencies, right? Yes. And it's because, people perhaps with those tendencies are able to rise to power when it requires hurting others to become successful. But also it does, again, it brings out the worst in people. Would people be as horrible to each other if we didn't have a system that required constant exploitation on a structural level? And then I also think about, something that over the last year and a half, especially, that I've reflected on a lot is, what is this like historically in terms of the genocide we witnessed? And there's so many things it's like historically, but something that constantly came to mind was the Jim Crow South. In terms of the level of indoctrination required, the sort of like racial hierarchy to justify eliminating people, or in the case of the Jim Crow South, also kind of eliminating them, but in terms of slavery, using them for free labor, and from cradle to grave. And that's very specific to certain places in the world and periods of times, from constant indoctrination of hate from cradle to grave. You can talk about Nazi Germany, but that was for a temporary period of time. It wasn't for generations that Nazi Germany existed. Anyways, those are just some thoughts. I'm curious if you have anything you want to add to that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And also, I think this is the thing. You're talking about the ways in which we can become disciplined about following a particular logic and grammar of structures of oppression. And that is really helpful to us because, of course, we can think about the particularities and the differences between Palestine and Jim Crow South. But what's interesting to me, and this is where Frantz Fanon's work comes in, is if we can sort of unpack this on a level of mechanics, on a level of logic, on a level of, again, the root causes of this, we can see the similar logic of domination, exploitation, coercion that then ends up perhaps materializing in different ways, but in the end, sharing a common core value of these supremacist ways of being that necessarily rely on the subjugation of another person along the lines of a racial hierarchy, right? And I mean, that's colonialism. So I think it does us a great disservice when we move away from those things because there's nothing more that Zionists and other people like than deflective processes. And then if we start talking about it in terms of a disorder, then people reach that and go, oh, look, you're sort of you're calling us mad or you're calling us this. And I'm like, who's lost in that? Palestine, who's lost in that? The idea of settler colonialism and what that does. And so I'm very careful about the way we do it. The last thing that I'll say is just like, you brought up Jim Crow South. I think if we're using the language of psychopathology, we have to also remember that there are things that were built into these categorical manuals that categorized mental health issues and like enslaved people, Black people who ran away. There was a category to say that was a mental health disorder as well, right? And so to remember the racist history of these sort of categorizations and that it is not something that we can then control about who it gets used against. And we have to be honest about the history of mass generalizations and sort of categorizations of people is most likely going to be used against us in the global South, which it has. If you look about the discourse about Islamophobia, it primarily functions in the way of like the Arab mind and the Arab psyche and all these sorts of things. So I think when we venture into that space, we are also venturing into a very dangerous sort of contouring of how we understand these issues. And we're moving away from really the political focus of our work and away from the fact that we get to dictate the contours of how this conversation proceeds. And again, being in the realm of pathology is not the way that I want to proceed if I'm thinking about it from an abolitionist perspective.
And I get why people do it, right? Because we're going to get into this a bit later, but I think the reason people go to pathology or to pathologize Zionist behavior is because the tools they use and the way they behave, the tools they use against us, the gaslighting, the lack of empathy, which is the dehumanization of the people they're oppressing, like all of these things look so similar to a disorder. And we think of things as such an individual, everything is so individualized in the way we think in general. But anyways, we'll get to that. I wanted to go to something else you mentioned that I'd love to hear more about, and that's the actual victims here. Because while these Zionist perpetrators are, constantly being like psychoanalyzed and in many ways excused, right? Because we're always hearing like when the Israelis maybe go too far, the most like the mainstream media will say is that they're traumatized by the Holocaust. Like that's always the excuse given is these are just people who are so traumatized by the Holocaust that they have to behave this way, which is obviously not true and totally ridiculous. And, there obviously is a way that the Holocaust is used to the trauma of it is used to justify the oppression of Palestinians, but it doesn't work like that. But what that does is then there's also the issue of Palestinians and Arabs. Like we are denied that same nuance, like the trauma that we have to experience, the fact that our resistance, our grief, it's all pathologized. Like you said, it's pathologized as criminal, as terroristic, as barbaric. So I'm just curious, one, what do you make of this double standard? And how is it prevalent in settler colonial societies more generally?
Yeah. It's such a great question. And I think, on the most fundamental basis, we see racism in action, right? Because that's, fundamentally who are you sort of imagining? And I think who are you making an exclusive excuse for? We see the same logic happening across the board, right? Like, let's look at mass shooters in the United States. There's the same sort of logic is happening. This has become an axiom now. If they're white, they have mental health issues. If they're any other thing, even though the percentage of non-white mass shooters is minuscule comparatively, we see the difference in the ways it's covered. We saw the same thing with Ukraine, right? The same sort of pattern. And so that alerts us to racism at play, right? Who is, in the most crude ways, who is allowed to determine their quote unquote destiny, and who has to always prove themselves, always be always already on the back foot, always already categorized as a savage, all these sorts of things. I mean, this is a historical trend that I don't have to analyze for folks, but I think it's important to acknowledge and name as we see it sort of unfold. And, you know, one of the things about it is that it completely flattens what we understand about trauma, and it's incredibly offensive, right? And plays into the, you know, the sort of exclusionist politics of the naming of horrors of the world, right? Because I think, you know, it would be ridiculous if we were to look at, for example, the Armenian genocide and say that every Armenian who has the genocide in their history then turns out to commit to a sort of ideology that is predicated on the elimination of an indigenous people. We would look at that and be like, what are you talking about, right? So I think there's something very specific also about this being the product, the Holocaust being the product of European white supremacy. And that legacy is still very much there. We understand that the formation of the Zionist state was an offshoot of that legacy. And so it also, this is what I mean about coming back to the structure all the time, because it's helpful for us to read the process as it's happening. And I too understand why people reach to these things and go, but wait a second, because sometimes it defies our psychic ability to understand and organize and distill this information and really be able to process the level of cruelty that we are seeing. My own practice has been, if I can go back to a structural political process, it helps me also organize internally, number one, all the affect I'm feeling, and also helps me remain committed to our political goals, because everything else is a seduction away from that. So it's the same thing when we talk about, when you're saying about the real victims, is to understand that process as it's happening. We can see, for example, framing it that somehow it's Zionists who are the ones who are being the most impacted by this genocide. Now, we can understand that as psychological warfare, and we can understand that psychological warfare as a central tenet to Zionism, not as an accidental part of this, but also the ways in which these systems work on our interior to deflect us away, because then we're in the position of making this argument rather than being committed to a sort of militant position that says, absolutely not. We understand and we know the source of this, and we continuously come back to settler colonialism as the source of this, not anything else. Everything else is a deflective maneuver that might have some truth to it. None of us are saying that people aren't traumatized by a genocide. That's what we're saying right now. If we're talking about the historical parallels, there's nobody more than the Palestinian movement that can say, we understand the effects of a genocide. We understand how a Holocaust of Jewish people could have a mental health effect. And also, we are not in a position to dictate that Palestinians now going forward are going to turn around and sort of threaten other people as a basis of this genocide. It makes absolutely no sense. And us returning to that and returning to the sort of holes in the logic and to the source, I think keeps us on track.
Definitely. And then, you know, I want to ask you with regard specifically to the profession of psychoanalysis. You know, you've said that mainstream psychology does not understand our communities. It relies on Eurocentric models and it ignores material conditions. And you even wrote a book, co-authored with your partner, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine. And it shows how these unconscious biases and colonial impulses appear in the consulting room. So I wanted to ask you, you know, why is this critique of psychoanalysis so urgent? And how does it go even beyond Palestine?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, by and large, we can look back at the history of psychology as being a profession that has worked hand in hand with state and with power to sort of exact its presence. You know, this is why Frantz Fanon is so important in Wretched of the Earth, in the first chapter on violence, which is the most misunderstood chapter that he has written. He specifically calls out psychologists as confusion mongers. He says, scientists, educators, psychologists, you are the confusion mongers. And basically, like, you are the ones that come in with your innocent neutrality and questions and slow people's revolutionary fire. And so just from there, we have to contend. If I am somebody who's within the field, I have an ethical imperative to contend with the fact that the history of this field is one that has worked side by side, both in terms of overturning revolutionary leadership, like in Latin America, in the construction of the Zionist entity, in right now what we're seeing in the United States with anti-trans bills. Like, psychoanalysts and psychologists are central to this work. And why wouldn't they be, right? I mean, if you look at the CIA counterinsurgency manuals, they're all have to, or Guantanamo Bay and torture. Yeah. So not being, us being sort of clear on that, that's, I think, to your question of why does it go beyond the field of psychoanalysis? My focus on psychoanalysis, and certainly Stephen and my's book, was because we are both in the field of psychoanalysis in different ways. I'm a psychoanalytically oriented clinician. I was trained psychoanalytically, and he has used psychoanalysis in terms of his own work on foundations of Arab modern identity and sort of looking at the social and political formations of the Arab world more broadly. And so there's a way in which the commitment to the critique of that is central to our work. And on the other hand, to say, what does it mean when there's an indigenous practice to this? When we wrench psychoanalysis as a practice from the hands of a Eurocentric universal subject and sort of insist on the fact that for even prior to Freud, that there were versions of us taking up these questions in earnest, and whether it's in our own companies or in our own cultures, our own questions around this stuff, and say that one of the ways in which we relocate this work in our societies is a way that we reject the colonial framing of it. Because there's always a way in which we're either beholden to the European subject, or we are accused of importing Eurocentric or white ideals into our space. And what I would say is that I think that flies in the face of a rich history of our culture and our tradition of taking these questions of the psychic world very seriously. We have the concept of nafas, psyche, subject, soul, breath, right? Which we take up in our book. Like, these things are not alien to us, but also we can reject the sort of primacy of a European subject and push up against that. And I think that's part of the importance, I think, of the work. If nothing else, to say, hey, we actually exist in this framework, and we have a way, and let me say agency. I don't like that word a lot of the times, but it's a shorthand to that, to reshape the way that we look at it and to see what is actually applicable to our spaces and to our worlds. And that's why, for me, and certainly for Stephen, for other people working in this way, the question of imperialism, settler colonialism, and capitalism and how it works on our psyche and our interior world is inextricable from this question. Yeah. A mainstream psychoanalysis is not quite ready for that.
I guess not, because you can apply that to anything, right? It's like if people are feeling depressed, like, is somebody depressed because maybe they actually have like a chemical imbalance, or is it because life is really hard because you don't have health insurance and and it's like you're always on the precipice of maybe getting fired, and like there's no security, no safety net, and you've got kids to pay for, and it's just really there's mass shooters. I don't know. There's a lot to worry about because of capitalism. If you live in the global South, there's a lot to worry about because of imperialism. Yes. If you live in Palestine, that takes on an entirely new, level of structural horrors that can make life really hard for your mental health.
Yes. And how are we doing justice? How are we doing justice to the person and their position in their society when we attend to all these things as a complicated matrix and dynamic that is always being negotiated? When we locate these problems just within the individual, we're completely ignoring those material realities that you're talking about. And we're not doing justice to the fullness of the person and the way that they move through the world. To the contrary, we were just resorting and regressing back to a cleaved off version of this person that does nothing but shore up the ways that structures of power want us to work, and forgetting that they are always at play, and forgetting their central presence in our everyday life and the ways in which they attempt to make themselves known relationally, politically, economically, through it and on our interior. And so I think there's just a way in which we need to be ethical in the way that we're not making a trade-off. It's not one or the other. It's always a complicated sort of larger framework that people are making sense of.
Yeah. And I mean, the white people in positions of power in this field don't take kindly to you pointing that out. And I want to get to that. But before I get to specifically what happened with you, I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on something you've delved into in your work. And that is tracing the collusion between psychoanalysis and Zionism since the 1930s, which is super interesting. So how has this shaped the field and its application in both the Israeli and the Palestinian contexts?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things to look at is that perhaps this is not specific to Zionism in and of itself. It's specific to the state building project. So if we can think about, at that time frame, what was happening around the world in terms of state building, it oftentimes was colonialism and settler colonialism that was happening. And that's what I mean about the centrality of psychologists and psychoanalysts in these state building projects. And so when you have these like proto infrastructure of these settler states coming up, you look, and you don't have to look very far and see, oh, wait, a central piece of this includes architects that are thinking through these things on a psychological level, right? In the case of Palestine, perhaps the most famous example, and one that is often forgotten and written out of the canon, perhaps not by chance, is that Freud was asked to kind of come to Palestine. And Freud rejected that. He was like, absolutely not, I'm not going to do that. And also called it a sort of fetish and really called into question this colonizing impulse, and was very clear on that. For somebody who actually, had his own issues with including the social, even though he did a lot more than people, give him credit for, because that is also, writing that out of history is also very, very useful. He was very clear on this one thing and actually said, no, I'm not going to come to Palestine. And I think you are going to anger the Arabs who live there. We are very clear on this. So I think that's part of what we tried to do, especially in the introductory part of our book, is sort of locate this as the history of psychoanalysis in Palestine, because oftentimes psychoanalysis is immediately thought of as being exercised and practiced only in certain spaces. And the people who have had a history with taking this on, and both its complicated history and violent history, and also its sort of indigenous practices, are always written out of the story. And so that's the piece. So I think, again, yes, we were talking about Palestine in the book, but we were also talking about, hey, we need to look at all the ways in which state formation was sort of hand in hand with psychology. And one of the things that I would say is that perhaps it's not surprising when we think about psychology as a mainstream method of disciplining people, right? Yeah. And replicating a particular social order. So through training, through the way that people are trained to listen, to what material are you listening to? What are the ways in which we use pathology in a particular way to categorize certain people, to over surveil certain subjects over others? All these sort of things are the workings of psychology. And psychoanalysis is sort of the historical trend. If we look at the historical trend of that, is the starting point of the talking cure, the talk therapy, right? That is why I think it's important for us to kind of constantly come back to the history of this, and that psychology and the practice of it has never been innocent in terms of creating a particular type of liberal subject. And now we can talk about it as a neoliberal subject or a capitalist subject or however we want to say it. But I think it's just sort of like rooting us in, this is the sordid history. And then what does it mean? If we know that sordid history, what does it mean to then practice or insist on a revolutionary praxis?
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us.
Yeah. And that brings us to one, everything you just said is a large, part of what drives your work. And some people did not take very kindly to it. You're an avowed anti-Zionist, clinical psychologist. You don't shy away from, exhibiting that.
Yeah.
And the Zionists came for you. And it was even actually before October 7th.
Yes.
I was seeing articles about you in early 2023, actually, and about how there was like this whole scandal inside the psychoanalysis profession. So what happened, the short version of this is that Stand With Us, which I think a lot of people who watch this show would be familiar with that organization. It's a Israeli-led right-wing group that attacks anti-Zionists mostly in the university, on college campuses. So Stand With Us orchestrated this Title IX complaint against you, trying to basically legally conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which has been something that the Zionists in the US have been trying to do for a while. But then on top of you being attacked in the university setting by Stand With Us, the actual field of psychoanalysis, the people in it turned on you as well, which was a whole nother aspect of this. So, I mean, feel free to say whatever you want about that period, but I think, I'm curious, several things. How did you navigate this? Because that must have been incredibly stressful. Did it surprise you? And what did it say, do you think, about the ongoing Palestine exception in literally everything? I think post-October 7th, we've certainly seen that play out in a more intense fashion with the escalation across college campuses, including sending police officers to basically go beat up students all across the country. And I'm going to add one more thing. I know I'm saying so much here, but you take it where you want. You shared with me a piece you had put together on the attacks on you. And I love the way that you framed this. It's so brilliant that the repression of academics, the smear campaigns, everything that you endured and others have endured, you put it all in the context of settler colonial outposts.
Yes.
Basically, Zionists have specifically in the US to reinforce the Israeli system in other places.
Yes.
So I just said a lot. So can you explain your side of things and just where your mind goes on all this?
Sure, of course. I mean, I think, it did happen prior to October 7th, which is a good reminder for us all. And certainly we know many others that have, whether we talk about Abab Abdelhadi or Stephen Salaita or Jasbir Puar, I can rattle off. How many people have we seen being attacked by the same sort of smear campaigns? What Tawafan al-Aqsa does is allow, liberals to join in full force yet again, like we saw in 9/11, to allow fascist discourses to become normalized in a very particular way with the joining of liberals, where otherwise liberals are very invested in appearing good and their democratic values and free speech and all these sorts of things. What we see is, on the question of Palestine, even pre-October 7th, but certainly after that this veneer just completely goes away. And I think this is what we saw with the case against George Washington University, which is my previous employer, and it was a Title VI complaint. But
sorry, it's a Title IX. My apologies.
That's all right. Because I think there are ways in which, wrong titles. But I think that we can see the weaponization of these what are important, supposed to be important guardrails for the rights of people not being violated, become weaponized through Zionist lawfare. And I think this is precisely it. And so, a telling thing in this is that when Stand With Us filed their complaint with the Department of Education, a reminder to people that anybody can file a complaint with the Department of Education, right? And those complaints are against universities, not against individuals. So what a surprise that in their filing, first of all, they released their filing to a right-wing rag the day before they file it with the Department of Education. And another surprise, that just magically the only name in that that's not redacted is mine, right? So we can start to already see the politically motivated targeting behind it. And you're right, I have written about this, like after a year of sort of thinking through, in a parallel to what I was saying earlier, of our need to discipline ourselves to think about this in structural terms. It's such, I'm not so narcissistic to think this is just about me. There was a targeting of me, I think, on many lines. The fact that I'm Arab, obviously, the fact that I was an assistant professor, the fact that I'm a woman. There's a realness to that, because I think there's a way in which a Zionist organization like this also exploit low-hanging fruit, or what they think is low-hanging fruit, to make an example out of people. We've seen this before. But it also ties into something larger, which is the expansionist ideas of settler colonialism and a synergy between Zionist settler colonialism and American settler colonialism. Like, there's a reason why the United States is such a hotbed for this and primed for this sort of intervention, because it's a settler colonial state and it's an active one as well. And so that's a reminder for us as well. But yeah, so they did this, and their dream in this world when Stand With Us does something like this, because we can imagine how many cases like this have happened that haven't catapulted to the level of like a global smear campaign, right? Yeah. And that doesn't mean there isn't impact on the individuals that are behind this. I've spoken with a lot of people who've had a lot of impact, have not been able to get jobs preemptively, all these sorts of things. But their dream is that Fox News would pick it up. And it's just so happened that Fox News picked it up, that this became a larger thing. And to your point, part of what allowed this to happen was the collusion of fascistic and right-wing Zionist psychoanalysts who were dead set on making an example out of me. The other thing that I will say is, like all other cases, whether we see this again with the anti-trans issues or the anti-queer issues, or that these organizations shop around for people, right? That usually the things that we end up seeing in court, they didn't come up with it themselves. They were just like, who can we go after and sort of prime and exploit for our political ends? And so the external pressures within the field, there's one particular, I mention him in this article as a morbidly obsessed, previous academic of ill repute, which he is. And I don't say his name because he doesn't deserve it, but this is precisely what he is. He's a stalker. He's known for doing this against academics over a decade. And he exploits his previous quote unquote leftist credentials to talk about this. But he also writes for the Times of Israel. He writes for these right-wing places. I mean, it's so obvious. And he's not a clinician, but yet he's on all these listservs. He shows up on all these listservs talking about my case and making an issue of me, and then wrote this utterly unhinged, more than 15,000 word article about me, and downloaded my quote unquote tweets and says he will hand it over to any Jewish students that would where are the feminists who are like, believe women, don't harass people, innocent until proven guilt? All these things fly out the door when it comes to Palestine. And those are the pieces that I really want to highlight. Was it a surprise to me? I think it wasn't, as much as, again, I want to go back, like, I don't have a narcissism that says I am so important. So seeing the work of your life unfold in the most odd ways about you is a really strange experience.
Yeah, I bet.
I was not, of course, I'm not surprised about the workings of Zionist smear campaigns. I knew Stand With Us before this, but to then experience yourself at the receiving end of this, and then the grotesque ways in which people's glee and violence and racism and sexism and sexualized racism and Islamophobia were just pouring out on listservs, and to really contend with the fact that, these were quote unquote colleagues of mine that I've sat next to at conferences.
So crazy. see.
And the dissonance of having yourself portrayed in ways that are so alien to your being, I think these were the things. But it really, I think part of it is because I have a political commitment that's bigger than myself and a cause. I think this is the miscalculation that they did. I think a lot of these organizations, consciously or unconsciously, think that this is a side gig for many of us. And what they miscalculated is that my commitment to Palestinian liberation is my commitment to pan-Arab liberation. And as centerpiece of my world, growing up under a settler colonial condition that understands what it means to be under the boot of imperialism and settler colonialism. And that's never going to be scared out of me. My ability to speak back to these things was not going to be something that was going to be silenced, right? But they miscalculate this stuff all the time.
Well, because they don't get it. I mean, because I do think that being a settler, being racist, I think it is a part of a lot of those people's identities, like to their core. They don't understand it that way, I don't think. Like they really do have some weird victimhood mentality. And they think they're on like the right side of history. But yeah, they don't get the other side of it at all. And I can relate to you so much on that. Like I know you were raised partly in Lebanon, partly in North America. I was only raised in North America, but I visited Lebanon a few times when I was a kid, but my family is Lebanese. I grew up with Palestine. Like I grew up with that around me all the time. My parents took me to protests. They were always against, Zionism and Israel and the US funding Israel to like destroy Lebanon and destroy the region. And so that I was born radicalized. That's just what I came from. And I learned more along the way, of course. But so that's all to say, I would love to hear some of your origin story, which I've heard some of it before, but I'd love for you to share that with my audience, because I think it is important. It is such a big part of your identity and why you fight for the things that you fight for. So how were you radicalized? What, and what in your upbringing shaped your politics? And I guess, how have you applied that in your professional life?
Yeah. I mean, the tongue in cheek is disalienation, to give a nod to Fanon as well. But I mean that. And I think it's funny because I don't tend to think about it as radical in any way. I think about it as a wajib, a duty for us. And I don't mean that to discredit the concept of being radical. I know in reference point to the miserable liberals were around, it does feel quite radical, but I think that there are ways in which to normalize this position as the only position that we could possibly take if we are truly committed to bringing about a world in which these hierarchies and the suffering of people at the hands of those who exploit them can become possible. That for me, there's nothing radical about that. It's just like, why would I wake up every morning and commit to a world that had these contradictions within it? I can understand that as a revolutionary commitment, because revolution means you are committed to the disruption of the systems and the dismantling and the overhaul of these systems that perpetuate those conditions. But I think, kind of like what I was saying before, I certainly understand, both of us as Lebanese people, that there are many Lebanese Arabs that don't commit themselves to this.
That's true.
There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. That is a different conversation.
Yeah.
But I think that this is where the disalienation is, that, I went to the American University of Beirut, and it was there. I also grew up in a family that was pro-Palestine. That was not an issue, in my family. But going to the American University of Beirut and then watching and being a part of the marches against the invasion of Iraq. And from there, over the past 25 years, watching how imperialism ravaged our region and reconfigured the way that it works, lights something up inside of you. And then alongside that, being really grateful to mentors and people around me who helped me piece together a political commitment that respected what it meant to wear a hatta. What does it mean to wear a kufi? That this is not just a performative aspect. It's one that says, when I put this on, I recognize, number one, the history of Lebanon and Palestine together, and the disconnect that imperialism created between our people. And also what it means to every day say, I'm fighting for a world in which settler colonialism doesn't exist, whether that's from Palestine to Lebanon to Turtle Island, right? That helped me distill over the years. I did not have the language for much of this was intuitive. And I think that intuition was something that, again, through mentorship, through reading, through political education, helps distill a grammar of what it means to be committed to liberation struggles and solidarity struggles. And so I think I can look backwards to answer that question. It's like at the time, it just felt natural to me. Like, how could I imagine this world? And I could see around me what the wrecking effects of this was, whether it was an internalization of like the values of imperialism, whether that was through France or America, and seeing what it did on the local level in Lebanon, and then going to graduate school in the United States and being like, holy, this is a whole other level of impact, and kind of saying, okay, I need to understand this. And in my understanding, trying to understand, I was also keenly aware of all the invitations and seductions away from that political understanding. Right? Like when I went to the United States, the number of people that consciously and unconsciously tried to lure me into white supremacy. And maybe, you know, as a light-skinned Arab and as someone without an accent, as someone without a hijab, all the things we can sort of list off, I realized, oh, this is an easy turn for some people. It's an easier road to travel. And that became, I think, the language of what I committed to, of like, I'm going to disrupt every attempt to this seduction. And it became a conscious process, not just an unconscious process, because I would feel it first, viscerally, and then like afterwards be like, what is happening here? And how am I always the aggressor? Whether I'm silent, whether I speak, I am always experiencing something else is happening. And clearly it's not my phenotype that's doing that. Right? So it was a bunch of these things together. And again, I can't but be so grateful both to ancestors and people before me and people who fight the struggle and people who paid a big price for fighting the struggle to show me every single day what it meant, and to understand that our fights for liberation aren't without risk. And so it was also coming to terms with like, all right, if I'm committed to this, then I also have to find a way to understand that the risk is always there, you know?
Yeah, it does. No, it definitely takes risk at different, varying levels depending on where you are in the world and what industry you're in and what your identity is. But it is a risk for sure. But it's like and it is easy. It is easy to just, it would be easy, I guess, if you can like sort of quiet your conscience a little bit to just be, we used to joke, oh yeah, if I just suddenly see the light and become a Zionist, I can make good money if I'm ever out of a job. I mean, I would never, ever do that. Someone cut this and put it online. I will never do that. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.